Hello everyone, today we talk about Maurice de Saxe, one of the most famous, important, and really extraordinary 18th century generals, a figure that we never addressed really because given that the channel has been mostly about ancient and medieval warfare, I just made some excursions so far into the second modern age, while I count on augmenting the amount of videos on the era, especially from a military point of view. I'm thinking I'm making also something more general, political, about, for example, the Habsburgic Empire, etc. Because ideally, I always intended to cover that sooner or later. And I see the channel is growing. There is kind of broader audience, and of course more varying interest, etc. And I want always to provide with a unitary say point, right, meaning of this channel that cannot be done unless I actually expand the thing. Because most people, I think, that subscribe legitimately, especially if they have never followed my work over the years, they do not know what this thing really means. This is not just a marketing policy. Let's talk about Maurice de Saxe because I hope to get more views in general as the cool topic, right? There is all sort of a machination behind the scene that has, say, completely different purpose, and that looks at the content I put out here as a unique one, right? So none of these videos has any meaning without the entire work, and this is naturally very important for the audience to understand because that's literally how it's supposed to be consumed, right? I know this happens differently anyway, but still, right? Just know that there is an added quality of what you will receive as such through watching more in that way. Maurice de Saxe is just, again, a very peculiar character in himself. Today we will not talk about, say, just all his military exploit in detail, right? Nor about his biography in detail. A sort of mix, an overview on the guy, and we'll surely look at single battles like Fontenoy, etc. in videos dedicated to just the tactical analysis, of course. But it's important to picture this figure within, I think, the European military culture of the time, the French army, that I made a video just yesterday and that I need to expand brutally on because it's one of the single most important topics in the history of mankind, of course, from a military point of view. And I believe that Maurice of Saxony can provide us with an insight about both kind of the mindset, right? Because this man was just famous mostly for being a womanizer, right? Just like his family and all this, but his personal connections, like ambitions all across Europe, just by themselves tell you what kind of mindset overall an aristocrat of this caliber could have, also in function of why he would serve a country rather than another. There is here a very interesting intertwinement between him and his mentor Eugene von Savoie, that literally signed himself with the Italian, German, and French name, placed on the different words. That I also made a series a couple of years ago, and that I will probably re-upload while I go on vacations for a week, so I will not leave you without food, let's say, and that I want to keep on continuing because I hadn't finished it, right? We were still in Eugene's youth at the time, but that's yet another fascinating character within, and this counts for the series, for example, on modern military theory, that connects us with von Clausewitz, Frederick the Great, Montecuccoli, Machiavelli, Manius, Wellhausen, etc. From one side, and on the other, this kind of broader traditional meaning of of the Ancien Regime, of who these people were and what they believed about the world, and also the sheer military history of it all, without which you cannot fully appreciate what it meant for these individual characters to carry out successfully such feats, and what is the scale of that, what's the value of it, right, for just the meaning of Western civilization and beyond, right? But the switch here is fascinating because Maurice was, say, Eugene, in order of time, was, as you know, essentially an Italian-French raised in Paris from the Soissons Savoy house. I mean, right, was in the French field, and he abandons Versailles, Louis XIV, etc., for Vienna, right, the 1683 Ottoman siege, to defend, in fact, a different idea of Europe, or at least still within this sort of traditional imperial hierarchy. He was fascinated with the exploit of Montecuccoli. He had a sense, still, these were all, for example, descended from Charles V, just like Louis XIV, right? Just for telling you what blood these people had. And so Louis XIV, later on, because of the French disasters in Flanders at the hands of Marlborough and Eugene combined, where the young Maurice was, from their side, by the way, reflected on what kind of sin he would have had committed for suffering such heavy defeat, and having let the young Eugene go, that had asked just for the command of a French of a unit in the French Royal Army. Well, Maurice does the opposite, because he was in the field of the Allies against France originally. He was a bit of a globe-trotter, at least Europe-trotter, in terms of whichever opportunity would arise, like he would be welcomed in part. He was, as we also learn now, an illegitimate son, eventually recognized by the King of Poland, and yet he would pass to the French side, right, to become one of the single most successful commanders in the era, right, giving France, unprecedented glory as far as, for example, the victory over an English army on continental Europe since the time of Louis IX, right? So we're talking a big deal of stuff here. He was gifted, as we'll see now, with the castle of Chambord. If you have never visited it, I assure you it's really beautiful. And he embodies, just as a very sensual, sort of also impetuous, but tendentially introverted and still somehow incredibly capable individual. But that sense of grandeur, that's the best of the Ancien Regime during the 18th century would embody, right? The true meaning of that tradition that doesn't fit one, say, national flag or another, but fits just the prestige of the man. That truly earned his place in the firmament of the great commanders in history. So when we look at 18th century warfare, we made just recently some videos about that, we generally think of this sort of stereotypical maneuver, endless siege warfare, like this sort of eternal indecision because of the tendential symmetry also that European armies by this point, it also considering their sides, had achieved to balance the odds in engagements where literally tens of thousands of men could die with hundreds of thousands of contendants concentrated on the same fight. So first of all, a scale of warfare that had never been achieved before, and thus that we say, well, we of course went beyond and say, well, these guys were just trying their own way. But from their perspective was an unprecedented feat that required an enormous stimulation by way of also a theory. Maurice will contribute importantly, as you'll see in the end, with a treatise on the art of war, right? Unlike other great generals, for example, the great Prince Eugene was nor a reformer nor a theorist. It was just a hell of a spiritual figure, almost, and one of the greatest generals also of his times, arguably the greatest of his generation. And so there are differences, and I think that's also fascinating. I usually don't make biographies, but I think it's important to understand the man, right? The type of man, in order to understand also how and why he was capable of achieving what they did, right? So to break these stereotypes, of course, we look at the same period and observe figures like Marlborough, Eugene, Frederick the Great, right? And so this most interesting and perhaps colorful gentleman, Hermann Maurice, Comte de Saxe, for how he was named in French, like the Count of Saxony, because he had gotten a county from his father, the Elector of Saxony, while he was recognized as a legitimate son, which he wasn't. And so being a Saxon himself, a Protestant, by the way, which is also the reason why he could not be buried in Paris. His tomb is in Strasbourg, right? And with a beautiful mausoleum that was dedicated again to his greatness. He lived from 1696 to 1750, right? Consider this the shortness of these people's lives, even in relatively comfortable situations, because just like Frederick the Great, Maurice, they knew each other well. Maurice of Saxony, Maurice de Saxe, was lucky enough to spend the latter part of his life in peace after, say, his great military exploit, right? So after all the glory for that he had earned as Maréchal Général de France, a title that was bestowed only upon some, in fact, the most exceptional commanders in French history, with the baton and all. He did this was a huge deal, right? And therefore he became French by adoption, and he was associated with especially the greatest French victory of the time at Fontenoy. So we'll see now what his, especially military curriculum, was about, but I think it will not be annoying to learn about his private life and tastes, which we can immediately approach considering his family background. I mean, Saxe was the eldest and most successful of the 364 acknowledged illegitimate children of Frederick Augustus I, right? Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, right? Surnamed the Strong, exactly because of his shocking amount of children. Consider that his successor and half-brother of Maurice, Frederick Augustus II, was known as the Weak because he had only 147 offspring counted, right? So this apparently was a family thing, and it really makes you think how it was organized, interestingly enough, because, there must be a continuous train of women that, by the way, are only just in part getting pregnant, and so just if you make a simple count of the days and the encumbrances of these individuals, as we will see, they wouldn't lose their time even when they were on campaign, right? Yes, Maurice was an illegitimate son, but he would grow to be the favorite of his father, right? His father was sort of a bold, cold, direct, strong, truly, also characterly speaking, figure. They were all well built as adults, and Maurice was actually, as a kid, a sort of sensitive, kind of interior, like introverted, even sensitive young man, right? Again, what he would become, even as a extremely powerful general, that doesn't have to do with part of his nature, right? And he got very, very well along with his father. His mother was the well-connected and beautiful Swedish noblewoman and adventuress Aurora von Königsmark. Right, here I inserted, I don't use tags, written explanations in the videos, but there are lots of nice, gentle women. She's the black-haired one, right? And this, of course, this woman received a support, like a connection. They were all somehow, high, at least the ones that could maintain such connection, of course, affluent women. And Maurice was first raised in Dresden, so in the capital of Saxony, as a child, where he actually got, after all, a fairly good education, right? Considering how dissolute the Saxon court really was, the fact that Maurice was ill-supervised, right? So he, however, was able to, in fact, to earn that experience that would be useful for him in moving in the courts later on. And then he was sent to Poland, where his father had been elected as king, and where he, again, was very well liked and appreciated by the parent, but also not much followed, because aside from all the other children inside, of course, didn't have all the same relevance as him. But there were lots of very complicated stories, right? Just the other day I was talking about the Polish deluge. The situation of the monarchy was quite complicated, like between Sweden, Russia, etc. This would be important because, after all, Maurice was left immediately pretty independent by his father, right? That, however, wanted him in the army. And this is one extraordinary aspect of it that is not so unusual, after all, for if you look at the age, right, of career officers at their start. The same von Clausewitz had joined the Prussian army at 12, by the same age Maurice did. In the Saxon forces, his father, the elector, enrolled his favorite son as an ensign in the infantry, so that within a year Maurice went on campaigning under Marlborough and Eugene in Flanders. This is quite interesting because he joined, first of all, a bit with this sort of, imperially, there was actually a Catholic tradition of some sort. I mean, to start as a common soldier, right, as a musketeer in the ranks, right? Naturally, he was supervised. He had, these tutors watching over him, and of course, we are beyond the age of confessional struggles. I mean, Marlborough and Prince Eugene are evidently the embodiment of that, as allies fighting, under different confessions against a common, in this sense, Catholic enemy. And Maurice participated at the Battle of Malplaquet on September the 11th, 1709. Right, he was present at it, at least, and this sheer bloodbath that cannot be described in any other way, the largest battle essentially of the time for bloodshed, deeply impressed him. Right, he was 15 at the time. I also made a video about the Battle of Malplaquet from the question and answer series, because I remember I was asked a couple of years ago, like, what do you think could be done better by the Allies at Malplaquet? And I answered there, right? It's a hell of a battle in which basically France saved herself, like with Louis the Sun King following quite closely the instruction of his general, etc. And even though it was a tactical victory of the Allies, at least it was appreciated as such, in a fair way, strategically, right, the French got emboldened, right, because they managed to resist his enormous force, and they began to get the upper hand, let's say, spiritually in this endeavor. I don't have time to digress now on things like the War of Spanish Succession, all the doctrinal issues, but just think, as I was saying before, that these kind of battles had never been seen before. I mean, the size of armies reached by the time the late Sun King were so big that after this essentially inconclusive baths of blood, there was a general understanding that armies were better, smaller, more maneuverable, and strategy being a bit more refined is just enormous and mass mental resources. But this was also a very gradual process, which at least entailed at some point, even bold, risky decisions. So just the fact that you are 15 at the following of Marlborough and Prince Eugene, that you know and that give you advice, and that you witness the most important battle of your era, and that you see also the sheer level of pain and suffering and horror, maiming, etc. And you start having an idea of what this whole thing really is. It's really an integral part of Maurice's mindset, and in part also of a lack of règle in his lifestyle. That probably had something to do again with the background in which he had been raised. But again, the honor, the prestige, the sense of being leaders of men, as aristocrats, as a superior kind, right, as a superior race, and this quite noble blood, in fact, that they could boast, and even in, again, the sense, for example, of accomplishment you would need even to compete with your legitimate siblings, and this sort of sense you could switch from Russia to France, etc. From Austria to Britain is really exciting, especially for a young man that has all that aggressiveness. In fact, Prince Eugene noticed the boy mostly for his rashness, and he told him, look, this is because in battle he exposed himself immediately to great risk. That's what often young people do foolishly. They're designed to do it. But Maurice wouldn't forget when Eugene explained him that this was in fact just boldness. It wasn't valor. Valor was something else. It was a more contained behavior. And we can imagine surely Eugene at that time thinking about his first clearing of an Ottoman trench at a battle just outside the gates of Vienna, and how he had learned himself in his own turn. By the way, during the Malplaquet campaign, Maurice also found the time to sire his own first illegitimate child, which is quite interesting. The year after, in 1711 and 12, Maurice served in Pomerania in the Russian army against Sweden, where in the Great Northern War, so his father was, as you know, pretty much involved in the balance that was also quite precarious from his Polish-Saxon monarchy. In any case, on this occasion, Maurice was appointed as colonel of the cavalry. Right, and his attention towards this arm would mean really a lot. Right, he knew how to use cavalry, especially to mount up very powerful counterattacks. That would be the big deal at Fontenoy, right? And at the end of this campaign, Maurice returns home in Dresden, being essentially a seasoned veteran at only 17 years old. It was definitely a very impressive record in general. Actually, there would be other, again, young aristocrats who follow the same path, but definitely not with the same future of Maurice. So you can appreciate that this was also slightly earlier than other young men, right, to achieve. Now, the following year, Maurice reluctantly married a fabulously wealthy 14 years old that his father had specifically found for him, Johanna Victoria Tugendreich von Löben, in virtue of her great, in fact, fortune, that, however, Maurice proceeded to squander on his own regiment, because consider that, we've seen it in different videos, that great part of the expenses were, of course, covered by the single man. We've seen it for Eugene as well. At least somebody would pay for them, right? The matter was finding the money where, right? So also entering the monde, the good life of court, etc., having all these lovers really meant getting all the money you needed. And it was a fiercely competitive race. All of these men, again, had to spend dramatically in their libertine life, because if they didn't do so, there's such no money would come back to them. They would have no connections. They would have a chance to fight through this from the start, right? So at least this also was a bit another excess of the young Maurice. It makes you feel bad also for his wife, who already complained, among the other things, to be, of course, betrayed countless times. Admittedly, most marriages at the time, like this one, weren't based on love, but let's say there was still a sense of honor, a sense of, like, especially all this fortune that had been squandered just for also other women in the process. Surely didn't make her happy. In any case, in 1717, that any modernist military historian surely remembers, Maurice enlisted, in fact, in the very Habsburgic service. This is, again, very, very important. It was a general, again, here I will not digress on the political situation, but as you understand here, your background, your confession, whatever, it's not so much as important as the general opportunities that present yourself, and that are all still very political. There is all a lot of espionage behind these things. There are the same ages of intrigues, plots, assassinations, duels, and all mixed together. So again, the lifestyle, especially of the younger, the unaccomplished, was extremely dangerous in many ways. Again, a way of manning up, right? Bullying, traumas, bloodshed, all this stuff. Like, it was completely normal for them, right? But in 1717, Maurice joins Eugene of Savoy, that at this point, of course, was brightly, leading as a field marshal, Habsburgic forces against the Ottomans, right? Maurice idolized this man, just like Eugene before idolized Montecuccoli, and etc. in turn over the generations. He was just, in fact, a generation younger than the Savoy. And as you know, 1717 is the campaign of the siege of Belgrade, right? And this was a hell of an accomplishment, one of the great masterpieces of Prince Eugene, like the one of Zenta or Turin, etc., which basically the Habsburgic army was besieging Belgrade, was surrounded by the Ottomans, who counter-besieged it practically, and Eugene managed to break the encirclement in an incredibly bold maneuver. Like, before the attack, he said, either I captured them or they captured me, right? Well, Maurice was there. And not only, but he was there specifically among the two battalions that were shattered by Ottoman cavalry charges, right, and risking annihilation in the process. So that's also quite of a taste for a German prince that surely has heard a lot about the Turks, but he came from the north, and from a Protestant background that normally would just say the hell with the Habsburgs and their problems, that had a taste also of that kind of Eastern sort of flavor, right, of Sipai cavalry, of, of heavy, also this, again, almost medieval culture coming a bit from the steppes, the Middle East, this tradition that the feudal Turks had maintained in Rumelia and Anatolia, and that was seen in this context. Remember that all this, of course, all the Balkan and other Central European people, as Christians, fought under the Ottomans against the Habsburgs as well. So you could see really a lot going on there in terms of military, say, fighting styles, etc. And given that Maurice would have eventually made his most important career in the much more westernized, updated, and modernized France, right? If you think about his tactical, strategical intuition, also in his idea of the art of war, surely must have been influenced by what he saw in that definitely unforgettable masterpiece that Belgrade 1717 really was. After Eugene's triumph, Maurice returned to Dresden once again, yet that's the point in which he broke off with his wife, because her fortune had finally run out completely. And opportunistically enough, he departed for Paris. That seemed a more promising place, right? This is a great turning point for the aforementioned reasons, and a bit sort of as a manning up in some ways. He was at this point 21, right? So in full adulthood, he decided a bit to cut ties with the past, also with his great mentor, Prince Eugene, that was the most faithful to the Habsburgic cause, and thus mostly adverse to the French, that he had escaped as an idea, right, of modernity that he didn't like, right, opting for the more kind of traditional Viennese world. So trying his luck, right? Maurice was definitely very different from Eugene. That was, again, a more ethereal, spiritual, some sort of, maker. Maurice in many ways was more of a follower than we can think of, but surely one could rise to the top in what he excelled at, right? So he was not just a skilled commander, but an experienced rake who fit pretty well at Versailles. In August of 1720, Maurice was commissioned a Maréchal de Camp, so a major general, basically the equivalent of the field marshal, in the French Armée Royale with his own regiment. And this was a big deal because it means that you were recognized politically, socially, militarily, and you could experiment. You could really start, again, a career after all the impressive feats that, however, alone, without support, could never really be enough just to have arrived at that point and to step further. Over the next few years, Maurice devoted himself to debauchery and military study. It's interesting that his family had somehow thought at a point that by going to France he could be a Jesuit, or studying at least at a Jesuit college, which his own mother, that definitely, as we've seen, was not perhaps of the most candid of reputations, but still thought well not to be sent to. I mean, at least considering his military potential, maybe, he would have been a bit less moriggerate. But that was evidently something genetic, was part of his nature. He studied maths, becoming an expert in fortification, siege, tactics, and logistics. Not to mention, again, the ladies of the court of Versailles. So again, this brought him, like in the best society of the time, Paris was really the capital of the world. Maurice was well liked, and he became friends with characters of the caliber of the Duke of Orléans, the regent of France, and the philosopher Voltaire. So all figures that eventually would also, work for him, would also describe his exploit, that we know of from later times. In 1725, Maurice made a bid to become Duke of Courland. This was a Russian affair. Essentially, he offered to marry the niece of Peter the Great, Anna, but his own marriage was annulled after his wife ran out of funds, so that had remained a bit of a problem financially for him. The matter of the Duchy of Courland remained, though, because he, that was a separated issue, at least in part. And he had thought to make his fortune in Russia rather than France. He would still, however, settle for France on the longer run, because this entire thing, failed. But the support that he still received from the women of Paris in this Russian enterprise tells you how, in fact, well rooted he was there at the time. Women literally threw jewels at him. There was an actress, Adrienne Lecouvreur, who donated him £30,000, and that, interestingly enough, died shortly afterwards, poisoned, likely, so that there is a controversy for which we think that the granddaughter of Jan Sobieski, Maria Karolina Sobieska, there were lots of Polish noblewomen out of that deal, because, as you know, Sobieski had been made as King of Poland by France, and so at this point even the Stuarts had married into the exiled ones that now, in fact, the same Maurice would try to resettle in Britain through his campaigns in Flanders, had married into this noblewoman, and Maria Karolina was likely in love with Maurice, so that her jealousy brought likely to kill Adrienne for this alone, for this, of course, gratefulness that Maurice showed her before she died. So that's how heavy the thing. Think about the poison intrigues at the time of Louis XIV at Versailles, etc. These were heavy things. Women were heavily involved through their arts and charms in the active political life, as we will see now. Maurice Fortune, in many ways, was made by the same Madame de Pompadour, the mistress to Louis XV. And despite all of this support, Maurice failed. Again, this depended much on his on the female connection he would choose. He chose perhaps wrongly, and he was essentially to abandon the Courland enterprise and remaining in Paris, where he commenced his earlier activities of the ones he would be most famously remembered for. Because up to this point, his story had not been so different from the one of, again, many other young men. His father died in 1733. And this triggered for France, for Europe, the thorny issue of the War of the Polish Succession. And the war that starts really tests Maurice for the first time at a harder level. De Saxe's most notable achievement was in commanding the covering force at the siege of Philipsburg, which actually ensured the fall of the city. Right, this earned him a promotion to lieutenant general, about as far as a foreigner, and especially a Protestant, could go in the French service. Philipsburg, however, brought him, at that point, the attention of Louis XV's favorite, Madame de Pompadour, who, in fact, was to open greatly at other political alignments. Think about the French-Austrian alliance that was really forged by Louis XV thanks to Madame de Pompadour, against Prussia later on. But she was right in seeing him a more than a promising commander. And the pair, by the way, became friends. Voltaire said, "There goes the king's sword and his scabbard," right? And she began to promote Maurice's career, right? This is definitely, again, how things work there. And in 1743, a new major war erupts, the one of Austrian succession. This also was connected with Eugene, historically, because at some point the guy had thought of marrying the same Maria Theresia that, as you know, would end up with the Lorraine, whom she truly loved in spite of his infidelity towards her. Hence, by the way, the Habsburgs Lorraine, not just the Habsburgs, until World War I. This is an interesting scenario because Maurice now joins forces, not just as we've seen in Flanders, against what had been essentially the allies that he had served under in his youth, but he enters the same Habsburgic Empire, invading Bohemia. In fact, Maurice was put at the command of the French, say, so-called volunteers, just not to be too, unkind, saying, well, just like, again, the sense of mercenarism as, I don't know, Wagner. By the way, Prigozhin died just a few hours ago, but, I mean, the idea that they could enter even a NATO country to no avail, because they would be basically disintegrated just by the Air Force in the very moment, but still not as, say, a Russian force, right? So this was a bit like the same thing, right? Of course, these powers were at war, but there was ways and ways in doing things. This guy was not French, was just a Saxon, at this point legitimate, right? But in a political landscape that was changing, by the way, also compared to his father's alignments, that in fact were over. Like, again, I don't have time to digress on the international scene. But it's definitely in Bohemia that Maurice shows some of his greatest skills, right? Maurice would be remembered, and also as he voiced himself about it, as an offensivist, right? He believed really in the speed, in the possibility of, say, in fact, going past this war of attrition and, cumbersome armies and so on, and carrying out things swiftly with compact, speedy force. And in Bohemia, he really showed his brilliance because through feint and diversion, he succeeded in taking Prague without even a fight. He essentially took the capital of Bohemia with a coup de main. The year after, he did the same thing with Ega, by the way. So these were some, incredible feats that earned him the baton of Marshal de France. Right, all this without a battle, by the way. Right, this will be seen also later on in Flanders, like making the enemy lose time, energies, essentially chasing him, and yet delivering at the same time the result. It's a hell of a strategic feat, right? Acquiring something without even engaging to that major clash. He received, as Marshal of France, the command against a combined allied, in this case British, Dutch, Hanoverian, and Austrian army in Flanders in 1744. That Flanders has turned, since the end of the Italian wars, into the favorite battlefield in Europe. Right, there are some places really have all that, repeated, history of sieges, of strategic relevance, and so on. And some of them are very fascinating. At some point, we will also make some more precise strategical example. Here we are again in 1344, and that's where he replicates a bit the same Bohemian feat, because through a series of brilliant maneuvers, Maurice managed to seize control of the coastal areas of the Habsburgic Netherlands before the year was out. This was really a very important feat for the French, because, I mean, just the Merovingians had stemmed from those places like Tournai and so on, so there was a huge honor, prestige attached to these lands that instead had been occupied by essentially the Habsburgs ever since at least Burgundy was no more from the end of the Middle Ages. And this guy again come from Saxony, and so talented and by the way impressive in other ways, right? He seemingly had an extraordinary strength. He was very well built. When he was younger, he was a bit, not gracile, but he still had to develop. When he was fully adult, he was like a beast like his father. He was said to be able to bend a horse show with his bare hands. So we're talking again, even considering what this man did in command, because unfortunately we have spread this delirium for mentally disadvantaged people. That is to say, the generals are the butchers of the situation, but these men have the entirety of the moral load of the entire enterprise on their shoulders, right? So in order to be able to command, you're above everyone, but it's as if you had all of this on you, right? And you must be something, not just mentally, first of all, but physically, because this thing does consume you dramatically. By the way, again, Maurice was known to be a libertine, to take a lot of licenses, to really exceed a lot, women, alcohol, things like that. But like a military experience were really something draining, right, psychophysically, and to a radical degree. Like a normal human being is not able to do what this man really did, right? This is the beauty of it. Like Eugene was again a bit more Apollonian. Maurice was a bit more Chthonic, also in build and in tastes, and just even in that same boldness that Eugene had reproached them of, but that surely in this sense had created a combination between Uranian values, without which you can't be a great commander either, and the Chthonic basis. So again, it's at this point that Maurice basically makes the enemy armies all hurry, because he made these forced marches covering several tens of kilometers in a day or something like, and that like considering especially the quite calm, let's put it this way, mobility of large armies at the time had puzzled a bit the opponents. Up to now, Maurice's career, while impressive, was still, however, operationally close to the norm. We are seeing lots of maneuvers, a few sieges. Again, this is not about how he actually coped with that, because these maneuvers, as we've seen, were also more qualitative. The results were there. Yet there had to be a crowning to all this, experience, which would come definitely in 1745, right? That's the feat that will definitely make Maurice de Saxe earning that place in the heaven of great generals. In fact, in April of that year, de Saxe, with 70,000 men, quote, stole yet another march on the enemy. By advancing 6 weeks earlier than normal, he drove into the Austrian Netherlands and laid siege to Tournai. That aforementioned capital of the Merovingian kings. The allies hastily collected together some 53,000 men under the Duke of Cumberland, that was the second son of George II of England, and marched to the relief of the city. This was somehow typical from Maurice to daze the enemy with these fast moves and really being able to maintain, because this is not just about wanting it, this is about achieving it also through the men, meaning that if you don't emanate that sense of moral empowerment and that determination, and if you don't make your soldiers come participating to that vision, that will, you can't quite achieve this. You must have trained them for that purpose. You must know how to handle such large masses that are incredibly complicated. Also from a logistical point of view, you have to be sure that supplies are provided in the adequate way. And the situation was not easy for him, as always. This was the big showdown, right? And he knew that the enemy forces were technically superior. So what he did actually was leaving with the rest of his forces to meet the approaching enemy and bringing his army to battle at the little town of Fontenoy that lay, again, together with other villages nearby along a fortified position. There were various redoubts there already, which he further strengthened, by the way, because he knew, aside from the numbers that were not so distant, right, but still, from quality, that the enemy was had an advantage, right? So after all, that was the strategic point, and that's how warfare mostly worked. You besieged a stronghold that had its broader strategic relevance in this frontier areas, and you knew at that point that you would have triggered the reaction of the enemy that would have tried to break off the siege, and so the big engagement would take place with essentially the besieger sending this force out to meet the enemy, while trying, say, also to keep still the garrison within the city to under control, because it would have been very dangerous if they had been broken free, or if somebody had managed to break in, right, to resupply them, and that would have basically screwed up the whole thing, right? And instead, this was also on Maurice like a great achievement. Of course, he was playing a defensive battle, right? If the Allies didn't manage to break through, he would have won Tournai and the battle itself, so that would have opened to further acquisitions, right? The capture of other fortresses, as the same Marlborough would have agreed with Maurice in his in his vision of the art of war. Like, these pitched battles were considered ever more important, were increasing important, exactly because of also the increasing capacity of passing fortifications by otherwise, right? So de Saxe took a strong position along this Rhine. His right rested on a village, Fontenoy itself, in the center, in a considerable forest on his left, right? He covered the front with trenches and established other 5 strong redoubts somewhat in advance of his front, right? So this would in part prevent the enemy from realizing, the extent of Maurice's forces and where they were actually deployed along the line to attack. This would be a mistake in fact, the British committed from Cumberland and from the rest of the and down the chain, right? Interestingly enough, this intuition of just creating some antenna, some first layer of defense to hide troops was just a general strategic intuition, of course, but something that he had learned very well under Prince Eugene, who had practiced this on multiple occasions. In addition, Maurice held most of his cavalry and some infantry in reserve, in the rear, right? So Maurice knew that especially the Allied infantry was stronger than his own. As we will see now, he had a particular opinion of the French and their temperament. He thought they were better as attackers rather than linear defenders, so that he actually advocated for the use of columns in France, and that's just something I was debating yesterday that would inform the doctrinal reforms of the French army after the 7 Years' War. So definitely this was a defense in depth somewhat that would help smoothen the brunt of the enemy attack, still relying on trenches for also the main line to absorb the hit, and in case of trouble, as it would actually produce itself from the French side during the battle, you have this fresh reserve and the shock element, especially the French royal household cavalry, Maison de Roi, was among these units. And the interesting thing is that Maurice was ailing at this point. He had an edema. He had to literally be brought with a litter of wicker across the battlefield, while a doctor was draining fluid from his abdomen. Yet, as we'll see, there is also the same Louis XV who came along for the show of the battle, providing him, by the way, with a huge retinue that boosted also his number. But nor the dropsy nor the king seem to have adversely affected his activities, by the way. So think about the stress of this all. I mean, this is the major engagement. This city of Clovis is at stake here. This is a massive kind of regional engagement with enormous amount. There are literally hundreds of thousands of men on the battlefield. This is going to be bloody. This is going to be messy. There is the actual King of France that has appointed you Marshal of his country, and you are sick. And plus, you have all this incredible pressure, right? So this is the magnitude of Maurice de Saxe in pulling this whole thing off the way he did, brilliantly and with the utmost success. So what did happen? Well, the Allies attacked. The Saxes' redoubts poured a deadly enfilading fire into their ranks. Right, he had placed artillery quite carefully to maximize, of course, casualties. The British were essentially confused by the type of resistance that they found, because they thought the French were concentrated. First of all, they thought there were much less than they actually were. They thought that the French were mostly in a section of the line. They attacked the outer, but they found that there was plenty of troops there as well. They tried to enter the wood as well, but the French volleys, especially pushed back the hussar force that was sent there. Initially, the French even engaged with just 900 light infantrymen skirmishing with the enemy that did not understand, in fact, at that point, how many other French would be behind that. Like a ridiculously large force blocked by a ridiculously smaller one. So there were, pretty big issues with Cumberland's command. There were some subordinate officers that were put on trial back in England later on for this, because it lost a lot of time. Right, and it just failed to to spot the actual, say, best, right, surgical area to prepare, like for the largest attack. In fact, Cumberland was not particularly good generally, trying to solve the whole thing by launching this massive 15,000 strong frontal assault in 3 waves against the French line, right? And the situation was not that easy for Maurice, again, because this force was still impressive, even if sent in not the best of ways. It was still like a shock force that shattered the French line to the point of actually breaking it, right? In fact, the British Guards broke their French counterparts. By the way, there was allegedly, according to Voltaire, an exchange of courtesy before this engagement on who had to shoot the first volley, right? Which had always actually, it sounds chivalric enough. They literally saluted each other before, when they came at range and said, "Please shoot you, no, please you should," right? Etc. The point, though, was that the most confident commander knew to have the best man, counted on, let's say, absorbing the first hit, paradoxically, to just because it would have not shattered dramatically the order of his formation, so that the enemy would have actually lost in this musketry exchange its cohesion instead, which was incredibly frequent, right? As we've seen just in the preparation of this man, so that the other volleys would be less orderly, and so they thought in this way to obtain a greater advantage in the following way. It wouldn't always work, because again, it's not a mathematical thing, but apparently this stuff did happen. In any case, that's when the British Guards really managed to break through Saxe's line, to shatter it, at least because it wasn't a massive breakthrough, a massive collapse, but it could quickly turn into one. So at this point, the ailing Maurice, that as we've seen was not in the best physical condition, in spite of the edema, of the pain and everything, he mounted on a horse, right? He had, again, liquid, right, in all his, like in the abdomen, in the thighs, etc. So just what it means to mount on horseback, but he understood that without his immediate intervention, his personal command, the situation could have not been handled, right? So he reformed the French line with his reserves. He, in other words, tapped the holes, threw his cavalry in, and massed his artillery, right, to essentially compromise the various British ways of attack. And so this reserve managed, through its own counterattacks, in throwing the enemy back, in spite of, again, the quasi-collapse of the French line, French infantry line. As a consequence, like, this was a total victory, right? The enemies suffered a dramatic amount of losses. We're talking from, by the way, the French side, 6,000 killed or wounded. From the Allied side, you have around 12,000 killed, wounded, or prisoners, plus 40 guns lost. This is a massive victory. Consider that the two sides had, the French were slightly superior in artillery, so Maurice had began to apply again this concept again of concentrated, as we've seen, combined arms. We'll talk about it later regarding his view on the art of war and how things have to work. They had 100 to 110 guns. The Allies from 80 to 100, right? So they were pretty level, but definitely Maurice employed. They had the advantage of defense, but not necessarily the advantage of quality of forces. The British attacks were impressive, and they were poorly led, especially the whole plan, the whole beginning, right? But the quality of their forces was high, and this made it even a worse defeat, definitely, for all that human material lost, right? As a consequence, by the way, within days, Tournai, again, the city of bees, the city of Clovis, had fallen, and all Belgium lay at Maurice's feet, right? This is not just France. This is the man who made it, right? The commander, and towards which, in fact, Louis XV is very grateful. Maurice's career definitely doesn't end here. There is nothing so big as Fontenoy after this. By the way, from a strategic point of view, actually most of Maurice's tactical victories wouldn't bring, let's say, not in the campaign itself, but in the way the thing was managed politically, for example, would give the hoped results. Even after Fontenoy, actually, Louis XV remained in for 2 years in negotiations. So what Maurice could do about that militarily was definitely not, the card anymore. Maurice was, by the way, entrusted with the plan for the umpteenth invasion of England to re-establish the Stuarts that were in exile in France. The year of Fontenoy, as you know, is also the one of the Jacobite revolt. It was crushed by Cumberland later. In fact, it's during that year, you find Maurice taking again the field in Flanders, right? He was fighting at this point against Charles of Lorraine, while Cumberland was off slaughtering the Scots. And a complex series of maneuvers ensued, right? At the end of which, again, Maurice brought the enemy to the Battle of Rocou near Liège on October the 11th, 1746. This time, he was in a bit of a different situation because he was on the offensive, right? And he had to get things done, right? The enemy awaited him in defense, and the situation definitely was not that easy in spite of the previously successful maneuvers, right? Saxe would have won a victory if he had really evacuated the area. So the Allies deployed for battle, waiting for his attack, forming up in the traditional front line and reserve, or second line, as it was also called. And the Saxe, at this point, refused to play not just by the enemy's conditions, but by, in this sense, the rules of the art of war. And this also shows the true intelligence of the commander, because sometimes you have commanders that score a series of victories, but when you analyze what they actually did, right, well, maybe it was not so much their merit. I mean, they just had a good army, or the situation was relatively easy, or they, after all, just did play by the rules and won. Playing against the rules requires an incredible moral force and, of course, a gambling spirit and vision. All right, coup d'oeil. And again, these armies were not so wieldy as we've seen. So what was achieved at Rocou is really worth consideration under this point of view. Maurice forms his men into 3 massive columns. Right, the defenders said, well, we deploy in line with reserve. What about that? We have strong infantry. Will we be able, with the disadvantage of the attack, to break through? So Maurice decides to use, and again, I just talked about this yesterday in terms of the tactical details of implications of this, to concentrate the French in these three massive columns that would actually not, they would bring to a lot of speed, right? They would in part avoid being under enemy fire for too long, still risking to be hit frontally, so in depth, by enemy artillery, but that's where you must be able to calculate, to eyeball how many chances you have in this, not to lose enough troops, because at least in a linear musketry exchange, they would have had the worst of that. He knew it anyway, and he makes this three massive columns attacking in the very center of the enemy formation. All right. He used also small numbers covering his flanks just to channel this force, protecting it from possible enemy maneuvers. But this is a massive gamble, right? You must count literally on what you feel from this man's spirits, like how much you can rely on that, because the columns at the end of the day will, in the moment of the attack, will also disorder themselves dramatically. Like a line can advance and remain a line if it marches slowly. Once you channel this column in through, of course there is a lot of bayonet combat of course entailed by this choice, right? So you're essentially counting on the combativeness of your troops, which the bayonet charges were, people say, they were so rare. They weren't so very rare. I mean, they were doctrinally contemplated. Of course, they were rare when, especially during the linear exchanges, like both sides were exhausted and they barely had the will to even just mount up a bayonet charge, and people legitimately say that normally just seeing the enemy in front of you after that hell, mounting bayonets to charges, it would be enough to break the line. But here we're talking about something else. Here we're talking about a force that would have to engage directly like that. Right, and so counting also on the man from the front that had to lead the entire column, so it really requires an enormous confidence in your men that you must have acquired yourself as a leader in order to try this. And predictably, the French battalions suffered greatly during this charge. Yet, the impact of the assault was enormous, and the Allied lines were shattered. Right? There isn't a full French, total French victory, because it was about to be, telling the truth, if not for the brilliant series of cavalry charges led by Lord Ligonier that prevented, in fact, the Saxe from completely exterminating the foe. Because, in a sense, the Allies had bottled themselves into that same defensive position and being literally pierced through, and plus, the French chasing you, being literally broken, there wasn't much you could do. So, in that sense, cavalry, you see, was quite the mean here to, however, not finish the enemy off, like as the Saxe had succeeded in doing at Fontenoy, but just, allowing essentially your army to escape, right? Which is something that happens, let's say, in all lost battles. There is always some unit that sacrifices itself, but knowing how to lead cavalry charges repeatedly, so you must also have a very well-trained cavalry and a very good commander in that sense. It is a matter of just high quality, and this all for preventing from a total disaster. So again, this was also one of the most famous victories of Maurice de Saxe that made school and showed Europe, by the way, that this thing of columns was not something to kid with, right? It was a good option, and this general had proven on the battlefield that a big deal also of strategic disadvantage could be bypassed tactically by such tactic in that circumstance natural. Maurice's next campaign was that of 1747. Here we have 90,000 allies under the inept Cumberland, and the abler Austrian Daun that had managed to cut off some 30,000 French near the village of Laufeld in Limburg. Right. So de Saxe was not there, but he had to march, in fact, 50 miles in 2 days. Again, great force marcher, say, to join these blockaded troops to hopefully relieve them. And in spite of the successful march, the numbers were still very few, because he could get there in time. That's a factor. Also, as far as how many men you can bring with you, with 12,000 men. So the French forces were less than half the one of the Allies. So on July the 2nd, 1747, Maurice decides to attack with enormous ferocity, yet again, on Laufeld, by the way, that was occupied by the Allies. And this thing went on back and forth thrice, right? Thrice the French seized the village. Each time, however, being thrown out of it again by the Allies. Finally, however, about noon, the French managed to break the British center. The Allies thus begin to collapse, and only some brilliant action, yet again, on the part of Ligonier, and also the scarcity of French numbers, saved them from yet another complete defeat. So again, Fontenoy, Rocou, Laufeld are all masterpieces of the military art, right? In a few years from one another, by the way. So this tells you really what Maurice could do as Marshal of France, and this would make again school, and it makes you really think also about first of all the outcome, by the way, because indeed Laufeld was a beautiful yet somehow Pyrrhic victory. The Saxe had lost some 14,000 men, the enemy 6,000. Yet look at the numerical proportions of the forces and the strategic situation as well, right? This was definitely better than, of course, much higher losses that would have occurred if all those attacks had not been carried out, if the French had not tried to break through the blockade. Definitely Laufeld was also the Saxes' most difficult battle, there's no doubt. The only one in which his health was not a handicap, by the way, because again, the guy had strained himself dramatically in his lifetime, right? Following Laufeld, Maurice engineered the capture of Maastricht in Limburg the following year. This was yet another victory. Soon afterwards, he captured other strongholds, by the way, but he also retired, right, from active service after this. And you gotta think again, the weight, the burden, the exhaustion, the mental, like at some point you do run out of resources, right? He had commanded some 150 sieges. Just think about the sheer military experience of this man. He had this 3 big battles in an active career that spanned more than a dozen years in the field. And as such, he is an interesting figure because, as we will see now, he had the time to write, right, and to lay out his thinking about what he had learned in this hell of a military career. For his retirement, Maurice was created Marshal General de France, right, and he was gifted by Louis XV, as we said at the beginning, with the beautiful castle of Chambord. Right, this belonged to the crown, by the way. So that's how, potent Maurice's fame really was. So he remained there for the rest of his life, alternating between fantastic orgies and experimental drills and maneuvers with his personal regiments of infantry and cavalry that he still maintained. Which this is fascinating as well. He had grown dramatically rich by that point. He could have fun like that. Women in bed, men on the field, and again thinking immediately about the war. Right, this connection between sex and war is always fascinating, because it turns out that the peak of male, today we'd say criminality, but what actually means is the peak of male violence is also the one of male creativity and usually sexual drive, right? So that's where hormones, at least testosterone, provides you with that sense of aggressiveness that, however, makes you also incredibly productive. Think about the Minnesänger in, 14th century Germany, going around as mercenaries, chopping people to pieces, but writing some of the most beautiful lyrics that you can. One of the most beautiful compositions you can imagine, right? It's a bit true for the entire chivalric culture, and these men were exactly this, right? There were a few, by the way, that were so lucky to have some time after these exploits. For example, again, Frederick the Great, needless to remember what he achieved in his lifetime military-wise, but he had also, a country to administrate for the last decades of his life, which he could do peacefully, which was a big deal, and easy life at that point, or at least, being a monarch is not, it's never easy, but the worst part had passed, definitely. What makes the history of Maurice de Saxe less boring at this point is, again, his My Reveries on the Art of War, which remains, considering the times and so also what it successfully predicted, one of the seminal works of military theory to the completion of the Vom Kriegen in the following century. Now, the work is quite interesting. It contains a bit of all sorts of advice, right, on the proper organization and command of armies. Of course, there is a particular style. Somebody defined this as sort of ferruginous, potpourri written down under opium or something. But actually, there are very mind-opening insights, especially, again, considering what would happen in the art of war in the second half of the 18th century, that Maurice never saw because he died at 54, right? And much of which the French army would have been the protagonist of, by the way. He would add different things. I mean, he cared, you can imagine, everybody has his own fixation, right? How do you use the plague bayonet, or how you issue armor to cavalry? These are things that maybe you do not need Maurice de Saxe telling you, but that really help you in context to see what he was thinking war like, right? And in fact, most of his insight is by far also more complex, right? Maurice employed some of then on his campaign himself, right? The basis of his systems would be essentially a small permanent regular army, supplemented by a series of reserve classes, which could bring it to the full strength at need, right? So he was envisaging the creation of small, quality, uniform, we can call them divisions, right? They're actually armies in of themselves, something around 50,000 men. So not even so dramatically small, but still something that in his idea could essentially cope qualitatively with armies up to 100,000 men. Great confidence on his side. Naturally, he wasn't a dreamer in the sense that at least this was an advice, and the idea is that if you have this system, the enemy will copy it to you, and what lays between this and achieving the envisaged is, of course, a massive political, moral, social effort that needs, of course, a military reform to be accomplished. The idea, of course, and this was very correct to achieve this quality, was combined arms. So fundamentally, of these 50,000 men, he gave this quantities: 32,000 infantry, 4,800 line cavalry, 2,800 light cavalry, which is also fascinating, 9,600 dragoons, by the way, that he insisted on, by the way, not being as 18th century warfare had transformed then Western European battlefields, as essentially just cavalry that could sometimes dismount, but literally as the original mounted infantry that had to be dismounted more often than not and just moved that speedily. This is particularly fascinating because of his experience against the Ottomans, right? Surely the memory of Belgrade and those Turkish cavalry charges left him some impression, like what this more sort of calibrated, right, shaded, varied type of cavalry, and how flexible you could, also as far as mounted infantry, seizing certain positions, etc., you could go would help. We're talking also of 20 12-pounders, was a medium artillery, and 160 half-pounders. By the way, Maurice was also the inventor of a light field piece known as the amusette, which essentially would fire a half-pound ball a distance of 4,000 paces at a rate of 100 shots an hour. That he invented himself, right? It was essentially a handheld light artillery piece, and in a vision of augmenting firepower from essentially closer distances and providing even infantry with this is quite interesting insight, right? It means working by refinement. It also, from a guy that had all this massive siege warfare experience, that tells you how useful in small unit tactics these weapons could be, or at least in his vision. And if he had created it, evidently there was an interesting way of application. So this small armies formed on a rigid all-arms stable organization were to comprise 36 strong, quote, legions of infantry, as he put it, with some light horses and artillery, and 4 2,400 strong legions of dragoons supported by 2 similar legions of heavy cavalry. That's how he subdivided the organic. And with this force, he thought, and the say shock, stopping, and say firepower combined, again, this to cope at least with enemies double size for what naturally armies at the time really were, right? And this vision is fascinating because it looks at essentially what would really happen during the second half of the 18th century. So the creation of divisions, the idea that there had to be essentially standardized mini armies that you had to send to to make operating together, to combine arms, and this level of uniformation achieving, of course, a standard level of of security, right? On the fact that you were counting essentially on that same amount of force. That is essentially what developed also on a bigger level if you consider the Napoleonic army corps, right, and divisions of the time. So strongly standardized, so strongly based on movement. Naturally, at the time of Maurice, things worked differently from the Napoleonic Wars. There were strong supply trains, etc. But the idea towards that fluidification of warfare, in which you could count not on these elephantic armies, but on smaller ones that could operate, as we've seen, with great rapidity, swiftness, like Maurice was that expert in forced marches, in that fast, rapid movements to elude the enemies, seemed really the future. In this sense, he was really right about that. He advocated, by the way, for the introduction of breech-loading muskets, though he retained an affection for shock action, which, as we've seen, is also what would be discussed later on. He was a fan of the ordre profond, so the columns, right, the order in depth, right? Regarding the muskets here, we have to understand that in his times, muskets still weren't even used yet with the iron ramrod, so the low rate of fire was really frustrating for somebody who could operate so faster at an operational level for this miserable tactical performance. So that's why he began to operate with to experiment even with this smaller hand artillery kind of stuff, like trying to surpass that technological advancement would take more time. He was a forethinker, definitely. He advocated for more practical uniforms. Well, he again thought that it was important to use adequately skirmishing tactics, right, for, as we've seen, screening the larger forces, for which dragoons, cavalry, light infantry had all to be very intensively synergic. For this reason, he urged the use of a lighter and more maneuverable artillery. This also would essentially spread later on as normal, like mobile artillery being pretty much necessary in that sense of assisting troops at close range and combined arms. A greater grievance was also for the scarcity of professional officers. He really needed more of those, and this is a topic I discussed in the video about French officers' appointment. That looks exactly at mostly the competition between the lower nobility and the bourgeoisie, right? And in this sense, Maurice was aware of the importance of the lower nobility also as the ones that really were the bulk of the French army, and he was mostly complaining towards the upper echelons of the nobility that received commissions but without being experienced. Has a bit the same old story, but the more you descend in the nobiliary ranks, the better troops, and so the better officers, the ones that Maurice admired, really were. As we've seen, he had a considerable experience rising right from the bottom, so he had quite an idea of how things really work. This was not just a problem with France, but France was a system that suffered that, especially at the top. Maurice thought was innovative also as siege warfare was concerned. France had essentially developed a defensivistic idea of her strategy, right? Of course, she was projected towards the invasion of neighboring countries, and especially the Netherlands, the Rhineland. And as such, Vauban had, as you know, been instrumental in providing the realm with this massive chain of fortifications. Right, Vauban was the greatest military engineer in history, and he really allowed France to rest on an impressive defensive set that prevented also primarily thanks to the army on the field, not on the fortifications, but together in that integrated fashion from the Allies marching on Paris, which is what instead would happen during the Napoleonic Wars. This had, however, provided France with a sort of defensivistic bias regarding fortifications. Maurice thought, like Marlborough said it before, that the emphasis had to be put on great resolutive battles, through quality, through maneuver, through this also greater speed, right? To prevent, like through this push, even the enemy to just think they could be playing on that frontier, as most of these wars that we have seen were proving. So in other words, increasing the offensiveness of the French forces, as we explained, like nothing has a strategic value just per se, nor fortifications do. If you don't have an army, if you don't have garrisons, if you don't have a unified interactive command, you can't quite defend the system. It's all about a concert of all the various instruments that you have. For this reason, he was pushing for definitely a much more aggressive strategy in general, and this would prove particularly prescient as far as the 7 Years' War was concerned. Right, many of his ideas at that point were realized, such as the introduction of the division, small legions of all arms, notions, as we've seen, he had experimented with and recommended in the Reveries. But also, the French realized that their attitude, especially during the 7 Years' War, but not only, right, in terms of control of the colonies, defense of fortresses, etc., was just too passive. Right, this was being criticized, generally speaking, to the French at that point. They had actually a very strong military, but they made a very poor use of it because of lack of strategic initiative and coordination and sense of measure between the two things. So here there is a problem that goes beyond. It's one in strategic culture altogether, still for, however, a power that is truly the hegemonic one in Europe. Alright, so again, Maurice died before the 7 Years' War. But much of his ideas, as far as what would have been recovered later on in the French army, let's see, the profound change that I was talking about yesterday, through the introduction of more flexible tactics, more maneuverable artillery, more permanent organization in peacetime, well, these all were achieved by France, by a massive reform that was as important as the one of Louis XIV, and that Maurice had somehow foreseen, advised, and surely inspired. Right? So, Maurice of Saxony is one of those names that you hear here and there, let's say, for all the experts of militaria, he's definitely a well-known figure. But in general, pop culture doesn't consider him so much. It's little known, like as most things, right? But his person definitely belongs to an age that must be understood, and that I suspect it's in fact not cared about because it's misinterpreted as most history, like the sense of, for example, of nationalism that prevails over imperial tradition, for example, and universal one. You see how many countries Maurice served, but for what? For achieving essentially an heroic feat, right? Who was he? a German, Swede, a French, like all these passages, right? I think most people today, even most adults, most elderly today, do not understand anymore, because the world in which they have been raised is one that, up to this day, of course, has completely forgotten the actual meaning of imperial tradition and identity, right? And even Maurice's excess, you have to look at that even in his private life, etc., as all one with this enormous ambition and sense of life, right, of lust for life and greatness and desire to conquer and to achieve and to fight, right? Not something like this passive aggressiveness of people that are basically thinking that they belong to a box with a flag placed on, without seeing themselves in a metaphysical sense, which is of course the degree by which humanity has degenerated into the complete worthlessness of itself. And it's also, of course, in millennia after, say, the last true transfiguration, a mortal, right? Maurice de Saxe gave up his ghost at his chateau of Chambord in 1750 of epidemic typhus, putrid fever, as it was described on that occasion. And by the way, immediately after having a private, let's say, interview with 8 actresses, so you may imagine, even just think about the context, right, of a man consumed by his own passion, right? A sensual man, right? It was a magnetic, fascinating, sort of playboy of the time. And these women just flocking. Even he was fairly young, so he was 54, and not even. Oh yes, I think he was already 54. But I mean, the sense of your death reflecting in a way the way you have lived, right? And this is something, for example, I don't know, the Romans cared very much about, and the sense that everything you are bodily is also what you are spiritually. So looking at the debauchery of his personal life, looking at his accomplishments on the field, you realize that was an incredible tension within the man. Some forces that are very difficult to persecute, but they're definitely making one of the greatest forces, also morally, spiritually, of his time. All right. This perhaps the meeting with these ladies was the best way in which such a Marshal General de France could go, right, if he hadn't done so in battle, right? And it seems probably like a way he would have liked to go. And this is, say, my take on him. Of course, we will talk again about Maurice de Saxe, I hope, soon, because again, it's one of those figures that deserves much more attention today. I want to talk about, again, as I was saying before, I will re-upload all the videos about Prince Eugene. I will talk about Marlborough. we will talk more about Frederick the Great, etc. Maurice de Saxe is, in a sense, the least known of them, but also, again, still the most colorful and enigmatic and fascinating, and say, I would consider humanly successful, right? And I don't mean it as a compliment. I mean it as really a person who lived intensely, right, and enjoying like his life in ways that others really quite couldn't, or maybe were too either political or too ascetic or too like consumed by some other thing. He was instead consumed by his own nature, right? In a chthonic sense, and that is still for the individual, however, a way to see life, but would have been probably very crude, but also reflecting the values of their times, of his times, and the general accomplishments still that could be achieved through them, right? So that's it. So for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.